There are seasons in life when you don't need another lesson. You don't need a spiritual key or a familiar Bible verse. You just need someone to sit beside you and not leave. Sometimes all you need is to sit and breathe. You don't need to believe with all your strength. You don't need to smile just to look okay. This story doesn't have sudden miracles. No dramatic breakthroughs. No one rises in the middle of the night to proclaim victory. There is just one person. Her name is Tegan. She sits in a small room with a heart too tired to pray boldly and a soul simply hoping to be held together. If you've ever felt like that, or if you are in that very moment right now, then maybe this journey will feel familiar. Not because you're about to be transformed, but because you'll know someone else has felt as weary as you, and they weren't left behind. You don't have to move fast. You just need to know you're not walking alone. When everything on the outside seems fine, but inside, it's not. There are mornings when you wake up, not because of an alarm, not because you're excited for what's ahead, but because you simply can't lie there any longer in the silence that's stretched too far. Tegan has had many mornings like that. She wakes when the sky is still a soft gray, not yet bright enough to see the room clearly, but just enough to see the cracks in the ceiling and the hollow in her chest more clearly than ever. Tegan is 30. She lives alone in a small apartment in a quiet suburb. She has a steady office job, a decent income, no major debt, and no unfolding tragedy. Everything is fine, enough that people assume she has nothing to worry about. But what they don't see is this. Tegan no longer has a reason to get out of bed in the morning. She still wakes up, still makes coffee, still opens her laptop, still offers polite smiles during Zoom calls. But everything feels like a play, on loop, with no audience, no ending, and no real lines. Tegan doesn't know what changed. There was no big event, no trauma, no single defining moment that led her into the dark. Just one day joy left. Every day after that, it became a quiet morning, a long night without a name, and an emptiness that had no language. She used to be vibrant, used to bike to work, laugh out loud in group chats, used to believe that God had a plan for her, bold and bright like the sunrise. Now she only believes in clean countertops, neatly folded laundry, and remembering to drink enough water. The dreams she once wrote in a soft-covered notebook now lie on a shelf, lightly dusted. No one asks, "Tegan, how have you really been?" And if they did, she wouldn't know how to answer. Fine is the fastest way to keep a distance, because she knows she's fine, the way a withering tree still stands upright. There was a time when she knew how to talk to God. Nothing fancy, just small whispers when no one was watching. Not rushed prayers for blessings, but hushed words in the dark when she still felt loved. When she still believed God was listening, and that someone or something would come when she needed it most. But lately, the distance between her and God feels less like a few steps and more like a sky stretching far too wide. She's tried opening her Bible, but the words remain silent. She's tried to pray, but even her own voice feels foreign. She remembers the days when she felt the fire. Now she only hopes for one small ember, enough to believe she hasn't gone cold completely. One morning, she looked in the mirror, like every other day. Her face wasn't so different, but her eyes, they sank deeper, like holding something unspoken. And as she stared into herself, a question rose, one she'd never dared to voice. What am I still living for? Not because she wanted to die, but because living without purpose felt like a slow kind of death. And that scared her more. In a world where everyone seems to have something to look forward to, Tegan felt like someone standing at the edge of the story. No suspense, no climax, just quiet that kept spreading. Some would call it depression, others might say she's lost. She called it the desert. No tears, no cries, just a dryness that lasted, like land that no longer expected rain, and seeds that stopped trying to grow. And yet, strangely, right there, something began to stir. Not clear, not loud, just a fragile feeling, barely nameable, but enough for her to believe she wasn't the only one who had gone silent in her okayness. And maybe if someone else had passed through here, they didn't go alone. There are battles without bombs, wounds without blood, but they leave souls drained, even when no one sees, no one asks, no one names the pain. It exists, quiet as noon shadows. Tegan doesn't ask for a miracle. She only hopes that someone or something might call her name. In the wasteland where nothing echoes, a small voice, just enough to remind her she still remembered. I'm still here, Lord. And if you're somewhere near, please don't stay silent forever. When even prayer is no longer easy, there are moments when prayer no longer feels like hope, but the most terrifying kind of silence. Not because someone told her she had to pray, but because once upon a time, Tegan believed it was the safest place to put the things she couldn't tell anyone. She remembered nights as a 21-year-old student, curled up by her dorm window, whispering to God with a clumsy but sincere faith. No fancy words, no religious language, just the way a child speaks when she's sure her father's listening. And back then, she often felt heard, not with her ears, but with her heart. Now, 10 years later, Tegan still has a window, but no whisper seems able to escape her chest. She sits quietly in the yellow light, hands folded, eyes closed. But in her heart, there is no one to talk to. She used to think losing faith would be loud, like a flood, wild and overwhelming. But for her, it came as a prolonged silence. One day she prayed. Next, she wasn't sure she should. The day after, she forgot. Still, she tried, because she wasn't the type to give up easily. Some nights she opened her Bible and read each line slowly. She expected to feel something, but the words blurred, not because of her eyes, but because of her heart. Jesus once said, "If anyone is thirsty, let them come to me." She used to come. She used to thirst, but now she wasn't even sure what thirst felt like anymore. One evening after a long and tight day, Tegan turned off every light except the soft orange lamp. She sat on the floor, back against the wall. No books, no music, just silence. Some call it quiet time with God. But to her, it was just quiet. No God. She didn't say it aloud, but she didn't pretend either. She felt like she was holding on to a one-sided relationship, and then, for no clear reason, a sentence slipped from her lips. So softly, she wasn't even sure she'd spoken it. God, if you're still there, please don't let me fall apart in this silence. She didn't expect the sky to shake, didn't expect a booming voice. She just wanted to know if he still heard. That was all. It wasn't a prayer. It was the soul's last call before shutting everything down. She once read that God knows every sigh, that he understands words before they are formed. But now she needed more than theology. She needed a real response. The next morning, Tegan woke with two strange feelings. One, the silence was still there. Two, something in her didn't want to let go. Not because of a miracle, not because someone texted, "Jesus loves you," but because the words she'd whispered the night before still hung in the air. And she hadn't been left behind. She didn't rush back to spiritual routines. She didn't turn on worship playlists or read 3 chapters every morning. Instead, she began placing a blank page beside her morning tea. And each day she wrote down one line, whatever she could feel. Not prayers, not theological quotes, just lines like, "I don't know where you are. My heart feels cold. I miss what trust used to feel like." Strangely, writing those words didn't make her feel farther from God, but closer. Because in a way, she was speaking again. One evening with a light rain falling, Tegan curled up on her sofa and opened her little notebook. She read the lines she'd written. No climax, no structure, but one truth stood clear. Her soul was finding its way back, not fast, not loud, like gentle rain, like the first drop on parched ground. She began to feel God, not through sermons or miracles, but through the tiniest things, a small flower blooming in the garden she'd forgotten to tend. A message from an old friend. "How have you been?" A post she stumbled upon containing only this line, "Faith doesn't always shine. Sometimes it's just not letting go." And then, one early morning, tea in hand, eyes gazing out the window, heart still a little empty, she whispered, "I still don't know what you're doing, but today I'll try to believe one more day." That was all she had. And for the first time in months, it didn't feel like too little. Tegan hadn't returned, but she was moving, not fast, not dramatically, just one small step at a time. Like a sprout cracking through dry soil. And maybe, just maybe, her father saw her from a distance, like in the old story. The silence still remained, but in that silence, she was no longer alone. A verse in an old notebook. Some memories lie asleep in drawers until your hand brushes past them and they quietly wake, not with noise but with a whisper, like a Bible verse underlined years ago. For Tegan, that moment came on a rainy afternoon as she absent-mindedly sorted through the drawer beneath her desk. A task done not with purpose, but simply to pass time. The drawer hadn't been opened in ages. Inside were scattered things. A dried-out pen, a few old birthday cards, a brittle roll of tape, and a thin leather-bound notebook with a slightly worn spine. She recognized it immediately. It was the notebook she used in her second year of college, back when faith was something she carried daily like a favorite jacket. She touched it like she was reaching out to a version of herself she barely remembered. Not because the notebook was important, but because it belonged to a part of her that now felt so far away. She sat down and opened it. The handwriting was hers, unpolished, uneven, but sincere. The first few pages were filled with notes from the book of John, small group reflections, and clumsy prayers. Then halfway through, one page stood out. The ink was darker, and a line had been underlined in red. When the day of evil comes, stand your ground. Ephesians 6:13. She read it over and over. Each word, each period, seemed to echo with old familiarity, not because it was new, but because it was suddenly relevant again. Tegan never expected to face a day of evil. She thought those days looked like death, accidents, illness, big, loud, painful things. But what she was going through was quiet, colorless, without screams or sharp edges. Just a slow fade of faith, a silent drying of the soul. No one saw it. Even she had stopped naming it. She exhaled gently. The verse, once written with the zeal of someone convinced she'd be ready for any battle, now came back not as a charge, but as a gentle reminder. No demands, no pressure, just stand. But how? How do you stand when God feels far? When every morning feels like a fight just to leave the bed? When the only thing you're sure of is that you're not sure anymore? She looked down and noticed a second line, written in smaller, slanted handwriting just below the verse. I don't need to understand everything to stand, just to know the one I'm standing on. Her heart tightened, not from emotion, but from the memory that she once believed in. And now she wasn't sure anymore. She closed the notebook, slowly, no drama, no sigh, just quiet. A stillness, like some forgotten part of her, had just been gently touched, enough to remind her that something inside still lived. That night, she didn't read the Bible. She didn't pray. She just placed the notebook on her pillow and lay down beside it, looking at it like an old friend who had quietly shown up, saying nothing, just being there. And sometimes that presence is enough. The next morning, while making tea, she opened the notebook again. She wasn't searching for answers. She just reread the same line. When the day of evil comes, stand your ground. She sat still, set the cup beside her, and whispered, if this is the day of evil, then Lord, help me stand. I don't need to run. I don't need to win. Just help me not collapse before I know I'm still being held. It wasn't a triumphant prayer, but it was real, and it was the first one she had dared to say aloud in months. Sometimes faith doesn't return through sermons, but through a single sentence written in a forgotten notebook. A line not dazzling, but timely, an old word made new by God, like the first drop of rain after drought. Tegan hadn't returned to God. She didn't know if she still believed enough to stand in church and declare anything. But that night, she opened the notebook again and wrote in pencil, beneath Ephesians 6:13, today I stood, not because I'm strong, but because this old sentence held me. And beneath that, she added, if this is the day of evil, then maybe it's also the day I begin again. No rush, no explanation, just the hope that you're standing near. The enemy doesn't come from outside, but from within. Tegan used to think people only broke when something big happened, a tragedy, a loss, a shock, like the ones shared in testimonies. After I lost, I fell, but God lifted me up. She kept waiting for that kind of moment, waiting for it to arrive so she could name her enemy. But nothing came. No death, no storm, no crisis. Just a slow, quiet drying out. Gradual, shapeless, nameless. And because of that, it was more terrifying than anything else. She wasn't sleepless from racing thoughts. She was awake because something inside her felt like a dark room, And no matter how she tried, she couldn't light it up enough to see herself. Tegan had blamed her work, her age, her unfinished relationships and scattered affections. But one day, sitting in her usual cafe, amid chatter and grinding coffee machines, she realized her weariness didn't come from her schedule. It came from her soul. She was tired because she no longer knew what she believed. She couldn't tell the difference between thinking God exists and actually living with Him. She wasn't sure if she had hope or if she was just holding on to the shell of a faith she once had. She remembered a line she once read in a book. Loneliness isn't the absence of people. It's when you're not sure you're still connected to yourself. She closed the book. Her heart beat faster. Maybe that was the most accurate description of her soul. She wasn't lonely because she was alone. She was lonely because something inside her was at war with itself. Tegan began waking up earlier, not because of calls or alarms. She just didn't want to stay asleep anymore. She sat by the window, opened her notebook, and held a pen, but she didn't write. Instead, she looked at the sky and whispered, "I don't know anymore, Lord. I thought the enemy was out there, but maybe it's in here." She'd studied the Bible. She'd heard about unseen forces in Ephesians 6, about powers of darkness and spiritual wickedness in high places. She used to think it meant demons or mysterious spiritual warfare. Now she saw it differently. Sometimes the unseen force is doubt, that quiet voice whispering, "God isn't real," or worse, "He's real, but He doesn't care about you anymore." They don't shout, they whisper, they don't come with storms, they creep in during the silence. They don't knock, they slip through cracks. Unanswered questions, broken hopes, unreturned prayers. Then came a line she hadn't heard in a long time, not from anyone else, but from deep inside. The enemy doesn't have to make you abandon God, just convince you that you're walking alone. And she had believed it, not with her words, but with her fatigue, by slowly backing away from prayer, from sacred spaces, until she no longer knew if she was living for anything. Some days Tegan would get up, work like anyone else, answer emails, attend meetings, smile, nod, then come home and sit on the floor, still. No tears, just the sense that her soul was an abandoned house. But inside that emptiness, something new stirred. You can't win if you don't name the enemy. And her enemy wasn't her job, wasn't another person. It wasn't a shadowy version of Satan. It was loneliness swallowing her faith, doubt dressed up as reason. That subtle lie. No one's listening, so why keep praying? Tegan didn't rise in victory. She didn't feel strong. But that morning in silence, she placed her hand on her chest and whispered, "I don't want to let the enemy live in my heart anymore. If you're still there, help me hear your voice above all these others." She wasn't expecting deliverance. She just longed to hear a different voice, one that didn't drain her like all the rest. The Bible never promised every enemy would show its face. Sometimes the fiercest battles happen inside, unseen, unknown, uncheered. Tegan was learning again. Faith isn't the absence of doubt. It's standing within the doubt and saying, "I'll try believing one more day." And like a small warrior, no sword, dented armor, she stepped into a new day, not sure she'd win, but sure she wouldn't ignore the battle anymore. "Lord, If I am the battlefield, please don't let me be defeated by what's happening inside me. When fighting doesn't mean straining. Battles aren't always loud. Some wars happen quietly, in the early light of a living room, between a person and her own heart. The world was still. Morning hadn't fully broken yet. Light crept gently behind a thin layer of clouds outside the window. Tegan couldn't sleep, but this time she didn't stay in bed, didn't curl up under the blanket, didn't check the time on her phone. She got out of bed, not because anything special was waiting, but because something inside was calling. The living room was silent. She didn't turn on the lights. She sat on the wooden floor, leaned against the sofa, arms wrapped around her knees. There was no prayer posture, no soft worship music, no spiritual atmosphere. Just her and a weariness she could no longer hide. Tegan used to be strong. She led small groups, encouraged friends to stand firm, prayed boldly in front of others, told herself, "I will not let my faith shake." But now the only words she could offer weren't memorized verses or victorious declarations. Just one sentence, software honest. "I'm tired." She didn't say it aloud, just mouthed the words in the gentle glow of early light. A quiet sigh, not dramatic, but maybe the kind God hears best. "If this is a battle, then I surrender. Not because I don't love you anymore, but because I have nothing left to hold up." People say faith is standing tall in the storm, but sometimes faith is sitting down and admitting you have nothing to give. No plan, no energy, no grand declarations. Just a small nod from the heart saying, "I can't, but if you still want to do something with me, I won't stop you anymore." She sat there for a long while. Nothing happened. No wave of emotion, no breakthrough. But something lifted. Not because life changed, but because she stopped trying to control it. Sometimes what drains you isn't the battle, but trying to manage it alone. She used to think surrender meant failure, giving up, something a true believer shouldn't do. But that morning, with nothing left but release, she understood. God doesn't need us to be strong to save us. He just needs us to let Him. She used to see the armor of God in Ephesians 6 as a rallying cry. Stand, gear up, fight. But now, it looked different. A shield, not to strike, but to cover her. A helmet, not to show status, but to guard her mind. A belt of truth, not for display, but to hold her together when every thought wanted to tear her apart. Put on the full armor, not to win, but to stand. When you've done all, still stand. Ephesians 6:13. Standing doesn't always mean standing tall. Sometimes it simply means not walking away, not disappearing, not losing yourself, even while trembling. That morning, Tegan didn't write, didn't read her Bible, didn't take notes. She just sat and finally admitted, "I'm tired." And in that place, not strong, not spiritual, not in control, she began to feel something small but real. Maybe this is where God can truly begin. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Matthew 5:3. It came to her heart without flipping a page. No one claps for the one who admits weakness. No one praises the one who lays down their sword. But God is different. He chooses the weak to show His strength, the broken to rebuild, the empty to fill. That morning, Tegan didn't rise stronger, but she felt lighter because she stopped trying to be the warrior and chose to be the one in need of rescue. I won't dare call this full surrender, but I admit I have nothing left to hold. And if this is the beginning of something new, then God, please start from this emptiness. The armor of someone who no longer believes they're strong. Some days you don't need to win. You just need to not fall apart again. Tegan was in those days like that. She wasn't chasing breakthroughs, didn't need deep encounters. She just needed to keep breathing, keep waking up, and hold on to the quiet thread that she still belonged to God somehow. She wasn't standing tall like a warrior anymore, but she hadn't quit either. And sometimes that's already a kind of faith. The morning was damp with dew. Light was just enough to show that the world was waking up slowly. Tegan sat by the window, notebook open, but she didn't write. She didn't know what to say. But today, unlike other days, she opened her Bible, not from a reading plan, not to memorize anything, just one verse, underlined years ago. For we do not wrestle against flesh and blood. Put on the full armor of God. Ephesians 6:12-13. She sat in silence, not because she was moved, but because those words felt covered in dust. She had once known them, once I taught them, but it had been so long since she truly remembered. She closed her eyes, and slowly in her mind, each piece of armor reappeared like faded sketches from a memory, not as clear as the children's Bible illustrations she once used to teach Sunday school, but still enough to pause her heart. The shield of faith. She once thought she had plenty. Now, if she had any, it might barely cover her palm. She used to raise it to block the arrows of outside doubt, but now the arrows came from within, and her shield was used to cover one fragile part of a breaking heart. But even if it was just a piece, she was still holding it. She hadn't thrown it away, hadn't left it behind. The sword of the Word. She didn't remember many verses anymore. She couldn't recall chapter or verse, but somewhere in the corners of her mind, one thing lingered. He does not despise a broken heart, not a thunderous verse, but a sacred memory she hadn't lost. And maybe that's how the sword still stayed beside her, not sharp, but real, the helmet of salvation. The name felt too big for her right now. She no longer felt like she belonged to anything, but there was something about that word, salvation, a mystery she couldn't explain, but hadn't fully let go of either. She had been called. She had once been pulled out of darkness, loved even when she hadn't earned it. Her mind was still tangled. Her heart is still tired, but deep down a small, quiet belief remained. She had not been abandoned. Tegan opened her eyes. The curtain moved gently in the breeze. No angelic choir, no background music, just the realization. She still had armor, old, bent, unpolished. But there, maybe you don't have shiny armor anymore. No blazing faith, no long, powerful prayers. But if you still hold on to one thing, just one thing, you might still be wearing your armor. She remembered a friend once joking, "The nice thing about God's armor is, it still fits when your faith is loose." She had laughed back then. Now, she nearly cried because it was true. If you believe only the strong wear armor, You might miss how God covers you when you're at your weakest. Tegan whispered in her heart, I'm not strong, but if you still want to cover me with the very things I've forgotten, then I won't resist. She sat a while longer, didn't write, didn't keep praying, just let herself stop fighting with her own strength. And in that stillness, she realized she was still being held, even if barely. Maybe your faith isn't loud enough to shout, but if you still have a whisper, you are still fighting. Tegan stood, not like a victor, just someone who had realized, you don't have to win to be loved. Lord, my armor isn't shiny anymore, but if you still want me to wear it, then please keep it on me. Don't let me go uncovered, believing I have to fight alone. I admit it now. I need to be covered again. When Tegan thought she was alone, a story answered her. She had moved past the stage of needing God to speak clearly. Now the only thing she needed was somewhere to lean, not a miracle to help her stand again, just a place to rest. That morning, after a sleepless night filled with unnamed heaviness, Tegan got up and started organizing her bookshelf, a small habit she returned to whenever her heart felt restless. She pulled out a Bible she hadn't touched in months. The edges were worn, the spine slightly cracked, and the cover was stained with old watermarks. She was about to put it back, but her hand paused at a marked page. Not because it glowed, not because anything stood out. Just, her eyes landed there right when they needed to, as if someone had been waiting for her at that page all along. It was the story of Elisha and his servant, one she had heard as a child and even told to Sunday school kids. When the enemy surrounded them, the servant panicked, but Elisha stayed calm. Then he prayed, "Open his eyes, Lord, so that he may see." Immediately the servant saw hills full of horses and chariots of fire. Heaven's armies. They hadn't just arrived. They had always been there. The servant simply hadn't seen them yet. Tegan closed the Bible. Her hands trembled slightly, not from overwhelming emotion, but because something in those familiar lines quietly slipped into her heart. Not loud, but impossible to ignore. She rested her head in her hand. She didn't pray, didn't try to hear a voice. Just one honest question rose quietly from her soul. What about me? Are you fighting for me too? There was no answer, no vision, no chariots blazing through her living room. Just a stillness not born of logic or feeling, but something like a hand gently resting on her shoulder. She had never imagined herself as the servant in the story. She always thought she would be the one who sees, the one with firm faith, the one who prays for others. But now she was the one who couldn't see anything, and that made her tired. As she sat there, something began to rise, not through sight, but through memory. She recalled strange, quiet moments from her life. The time she almost got into a car accident, but somehow the brakes worked just in time. The night she was so low she wished she could disappear, and a message from an old friend popped up. "You okay?" The time she decided to stop praying forever, she dreamed of an old Bible verse, word for word, remembered even after waking. Not proof, not miracles, but traces, tiny signs, like footprints that don't leave marks in sand, but still trace a path. Maybe you've never seen heaven's armies, but maybe you've been protected without realizing it. Tegan exhaled, not in relief, but in peaceful surrender, like someone who has finally stopped holding herself up and remembered she's not holding alone. She reopened the story of Elisha, read it slowly, not to study, not to memorize, just to sit inside it, to sit with the servant's question, and in the answer, not through theology, but through sight granted. She didn't pretend to understand. She just heard quietly deep inside a thought that felt like someone whispering, "The servant wasn't saved by strength, but by seeing who stood with him." Tegan began to understand, or maybe began letting go of needing to understand. Maybe God doesn't need her to see to be working, but He knows when to let her glimpse, or not. And today He didn't show her chariots, but He did help her remember the moments she hadn't prayed, and still something protected her. The nights she saw nothing, and still something unseen held her together. Faith doesn't always mean seeing, but sometimes God gives a glimpse, not to help us believe more, but to help us rest better. Tegan closed the Bible. She didn't cry. She leaned back into the couch, eyes on the window where morning light had finally reached the glass. She stayed for a while longer, then got up and made tea. One hand held the cup. The other gently touched the spine of that old Bible, not to learn something new, but to hold on to what had just been whispered. "If you've surrounded me with what I cannot see, then guard me from the voices that make me doubt it. I don't need to see it all. I just need enough peace to remember I am not alone." She no longer asked for victory, only to be held. There are nights when you don't wish for morning, not because you're hopeless, but because you're not sure you have the strength to begin again. Tegan sat alone in the living room. The lights were off. She didn't cry. She didn't collapse. She just sat, arms folded, back against the chair, eyes watching the dark slowly fill every corner of the house. Her phone was on silent. Her Bible remained closed. No sermon played in the background. Nothing that resembled a spiritual routine. It was just a night, still, long, and stripped of anything that could be called clear hope. In the past, on nights like these, she used to pray, "God, change this. Show me something. Let tomorrow be better than today." But tonight, she didn't ask for any of that. She wasn't even sure why. Maybe because she knew things don't shift just because the prayer sounds good. Or maybe she had walked too far to believe in "everything will be okay" as a formula. Then in the darkness, one line rose from her soul, not spoken aloud, but so clear within. "I don't know about tomorrow, but please hold on to me. Don't let me drift away." That was it. No full prayer, no promises, no shining faith. Just one person admitting she was tired. Maybe the most sacred thing you can do today is stay. Do not move forward, not rise higher. Just not disappear. Tegan began to understand. Being held doesn't always come with miracles. Sometimes it's simply a full night of sleep with no nightmares, a hand resting silently on your shoulder, a Bible verse you didn't go looking for, but it showed up at the right time, an old letter, a forgotten notebook, a soft breeze through the curtain, enough to remind you you're still here. Maybe what you need isn't to move on. Maybe what you need is someone to hold you when you can't hold yourself. She remembered an old sermon, a line that seemed ordinary back then, but now pulsed with life. Faith isn't about how long you can hold on. It's about how firmly God holds you. She used to think she had to fight, to hold her faith, to hold hope, to keep praying faithfully. Now she realized she was the one being held, not because she prayed well, not because her faith never wavered, but because someone hadn't let go of her, even when she had no strength to cling. Tegan exhaled, slow, deep, not in relief, but because for the first time in months, she no longer felt the pressure to look like she still had faith. She didn't need to prove anything, didn't need to be strong, didn't need to repeat spiritual words that had lost meaning. She just needed to admit, I'm falling, but I don't want to fall farther. If you can, please hold me. In that moment, she saw a simple image. A child asleep in the back seat, head tilting, arms slipping, mouth slightly open. Not graceful, not strong, not doing anything to deserve care. But the father reaches back, cradles their head and adjusts their arm. Not because the child asked, not because they earned it, but because they're his. Tegan placed her hand over her heart. She didn't pray loudly, just felt one heartbeat, enough to remind her she was still alive and still being held. Maybe your faith isn't a fire anymore. Maybe it's just a flicker. But if God once breathed life into dust, He can breathe warmth into a soul slowly dimming. That night there were no angels, no special dream. But Tegan slept for the first time in many nights, not because the problem vanished, but because she believed she was still being held, even if she couldn't see the hand. I don't need to see what you're doing. I ask only one thing. Don't let me drift away, and if you can, hold me in whatever way you choose. A small faith planted again in dry ground. No one knows the exact moment a seed begins to grow. People only notice that one day, in dry and cracked soil, a tender sprout appears. Quiet, fragile, and no matter how small it is, something in us knows. Life has touched this place. Tegan didn't return to God in the kind of dramatic way people often describe. There was no miracle, no song that made her cry, no church gathering where she felt moved. There was only a very small beginning, and it was real. She started opening the Bible again every morning, not to study, not to take notes, just to give her soul something right before all the other noise came rushing in. She didn't read much, just one verse, like a single drop of water falling onto cracked earth, not to grow a tree right away, but just enough to keep the living part from going completely silent. That morning, in the pale light beyond the window pane, she opened the Bible. Her eyes landed on an old verse. A broken and contrite heart you will not despise. She had read it many times, but today as she read it again, something touched her, not forcefully, but truly. It wasn't emotional. It wasn't a word in season. It was just something that eased inside her, as if to say, "So, you haven't turned away." She closed the book. No sigh, no prayer. She just sat there, letting the silence soak into her like a drop of water meeting dry ground. Tegan began to practice speaking to God again. She didn't call it prayer, just short sentences, sometimes barely loud enough for even herself to hear. I'm still here. I don't know how to believe, but I don't want to leave. My heart feels empty today, but you still see me, don't you? She didn't wait for a response, didn't measure whether she was making progress. She just tried to be honest. At night when the city was asleep, she opened her notebook again, not to journal, just to write a few small confirmations. Today I read one verse. I didn't feel anything, but I didn't close the book. I told him 2 words, still here. That was it, nothing more, nothing less. And through those simple days, something began to return. Not loudly, not clearly, not like the faith she used to have, the kind that burned bright, eager, and bold, but a new kind of faith, small, thin, but real. One day, walking near the park, she stopped in front of a small patch of ground. The grass was sun-scorched. The tree roots were rough. The soil was cracked. But as she looked closer, she saw a tiny green shoot breaking through. Fragile, small, but real. She stood still, not because she was surprised, but because she understood that sprout deeply, because she was like that too. Sometimes you don't need God to pour heavy rain, just a patient sunbeam, enough to remind you that life has not yet withdrawn. She hadn't told anyone. She didn't call it healing, but it also wasn't brokenness anymore. She didn't need to name what was growing inside her, because some things, if they're truly precious, are better left to live before being defined. She only wanted to keep it quietly in secret, like someone shielding a fragile flame from the wind. Maybe your faith today is just a seed, but if it's still being planted, there's still a chance for it to grow. Tegan wasn't refreshed, not on fire, but now she didn't need to be. She only needed to know her heart still had room for something to live again. I'm not asking for my heart to burn bright again, just one thing. Each morning, would you place something true in me so I don't drift any further? If today faith is just a sprout, then please help me keep it alive. She was no longer alone, and God had never left her. Some things aren't measured by feelings. There are moments when you don't feel peace, but peace is still there. You don't see God, but that doesn't mean He's absent, and tears aren't always the best measure of the deepest pain. Tegan stood on the balcony, looking out at the pale morning sky. The wind brushed her hair, not strong, but enough to remind her a new day was beginning. Nothing remarkable happened that morning. No special Bible verse, no hopeful phone call, no feeling of, I've been healed. But there was something peaceful, not because everything had changed, but because she had stopped forcing herself to feel differently right away. Tegan didn't call it coming back. She hadn't told anyone she was finding God again. She still felt empty, but today that emptiness no longer frightened her. Sometimes silence makes us think we're alone, but maybe it's the first time your heart is no longer drowned out by voices that never came from God in the first place. Tegan took a deep breath, not to begin anything, just to feel that she was still here, still standing, still breathing, still believing, even if her faith was as thin as smoke. Sometimes it's not that you've become stronger, it's just that fear no longer gets to steer the wheel. She didn't need to know what God was doing. She just needed to know He hadn't walked away. And that morning, the wind didn't answer her, but it touched her, enough to let her feel she wasn't entirely alone. Maybe God wasn't speaking, but He was still reminding her in small ways. A ray of sun, a moment of stillness, a quiet touch with no sound. Tegan wondered how many times had she believed he left simply because she couldn't feel him. How often had she confused silence with absence? How often had she pulled away, not because God had abandoned he, but because she was afraid of uncertainty? She placed her hand over her chest, felt warmth through the thin fabric, a heartbeat, steady, as if God was knocking, not with a miracle, but with life itself. Maybe he had never been far. Maybe he had only stepped back a little, just to see if she would turn toward him again. She looked out across the sky, didn't pray in the usual asking way. She simply whispered, "I'm still here, and if you are too, then I'll be okay." Not long, not strong, not certain, just real, like someone finally saying something after a long silence with God. She didn't need a voice from heaven, didn't need angels, didn't need to feel moved. She only needed a deep down assurance she hadn't been let go. You don't need to feel him for him to be present. You don't need to understand him for him to be working. You just need to stay. And if you're still here, still breathing, still willing to open your heart even a little, then maybe he's been holding you this whole time in ways you didn't even know. Tegan didn't know what tomorrow would look like, didn't know if her heart would grow weary again, didn't know how long she'd be able to stand, but she knew one thing: she was no longer alone, and God had never left. Thank you, Lord, for the silence that held me, for the darkness that wasn't thick enough to lose me, for the faith that never fully died, even when I thought it had. I'm not ready for a big journey, but I am ready to take one more step, if you're still here. If you've walked with Tegan through the long nights, the wordless mornings, through the emptiness, the quiet, and the moments when prayer was nothing more than a sigh, then maybe this isn't just her story. Maybe it's yours too. The story of someone who once believed fiercely, then grew tired, then fell silent. Then I simply hope to be held. Not everyone needs a miracle. Some of us just need a sign that we haven't been abandoned. If you've read this far, this final word isn't a conclusion. It's a gentle hand resting on your shoulder, like someone sitting next to you on a night no one else sees. And if you need a place to keep breathing, to be reminded that you're not walking alone, stay. Leave a yes, and I understand, or just a single period. Sometimes you don't need to explain. God already read between the lines. You can subscribe, not because this is where great sermons live, but because this is where someone understands when you say, "My heart feels a little quieter today." And if you need prayer, comment. Don't be afraid. You don't have to share everything. You just don't have to keep holding it all alone. Tegan wasn't transformed in a single night. She was simply held one day at a time. And maybe what God is doing with you is the same. And if this morning you don't know how to pray, just let one quiet sentence sit inside your heart. I'm still here. And if you are too, then I'll be okay.